I'd like to welcome WPC participants to this talk on what's new in trial endpoints. I'm Karl Kieburtz. I'm a movement disorder neurologist and a clinical trialist. And I've been working in Parkinson's disease for some time. And there's a lot of changes happening in the world of experimental therapeutics in Parkinson's disease. The title of the talk is What's New in Trial Endpoints? And by trial endpoints, we mean the things we measure in studies, clinical trials, of new interventions for Parkinson's disease. Trial endpoints, we also use the terms interchangeably, outcome measures, scales, but what we're referring to is the idea of measuring something in the context of evaluating new treatments that helps us understand whether the treatments are working. There's a few attributes of the measures we use, or these endpoints, that are important. One is we want these to be measures that mean something to patients and families. And by this we mean they're clinically meaningful. That is, the measurement is measuring something that matters to the people with the disease. We also want these measures to be important to clinicians so they understand how the interventions might be influencing how Parkinson's disease is doing, both for the patient and for the family. Lastly, these need to be measures which are going to be useful for regulators in the US, EU, and elsewhere who are making decisions about whether the treatment should be approved as a treatment for Parkinson's disease. So there's different audiences who are going to be looking at these outcome measures, and we want them, the outcome measures, to have relevance for all of those audiences. So how do we go about measuring Parkinson's disease? Well, like any other illness, we can think about how the disease influences people. And in 2001, the World Health Organization published a monograph about the classification of functioning, disability, and health. That monograph breaks up and defines measures into, I'll say, two general categories. One of those categories is impairment. Impairment is measuring the deviation or deficiencies from what is expected to be normal regarding the performance of various tasks. Those tasks could be things such as remembering a list of words, could be such a thing as tapping your finger or making a fist and opening it, which are things we do in the examination of Parkinson's disease. And the scale of impairment measures the degree to which that activity deviates from what we would expect. This is a so-called impairment scale. In contrast to that, perhaps not entirely different, but in a complementary way, is looking to the degree to which someone is able to function normally, or the degree to which the disease they have impacts on their ability to do their normal activities. These are called functional scales. Functional scales can assess function in a variety of ways. You can ask people how they're doing, you can directly measure and see how they're doing, and you can ask others to rate how people are doing. So in the first category, we call those patient-reported outcomes, and ask the patient themselves, to what extent is the disease interfering with their ability to do what they want to do? In the second kind of scale, called those performance-based assessments, an individual is given a task to perform which might mimic something they would do in day-to-day life, such as make change in a financial transaction or follow a recipe for cooking. The third kind of scale could ask someone else how someone is doing. So rather than being a patient-reported outcome, these are called either observer or clinician-reported outcomes, such as asking a spouse or caregiver to comment on someone's functional ability or asking their clinician to rate their functional ability. Turns out in Parkinson's disease, we have a long history of scales that measure both impairment and function. The standard scale in Parkinson's disease is called the Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale. And we've had that for quite some time, but it's been recently updated by the Movement Disorder Society, and we refer to that scale as the MDS-UPDRS. And the MDS-UPDRS has three main parts that we talk about. Parts 1 and 2 are indeed largely patient-reported outcomes of function. They're called the experiences of daily living. Part 1 is on the non-motor, and Part 2 is on the motor. And those two scales ask people to rate the degree to which the features of their Parkinson's disease interfere with their ability to do their normal activities. So these are largely patient-reported outcomes of function. The other part, Part 3, is different. It's more of an impairment scale. It is largely, although not entirely, a measure of the deviation or the deterioration in doing certain tasks, such as I already mentioned, tapping fingers, opening and closing a fist. Some of the scales, though, are thought to also be functionally relevant. Some of the scale questions are thought to be functionally relevant, such as the one regarding speech and walking, because that interferes with function directly. However, traditionally, Part 3 is thought of as more of an impairment scale. And indeed, in prior drug approvals for Parkinson's disease, Part 2 in the old UPDRS and still in the new MDS-UPDRS, Part 2 plus Part 3 was largely the basis of approval. So that was marrying a scale of function, EDLs or ADLs, along with an impairment scale, the motor examination. Those two together form the basis of approval of many of the drugs we have for Parkinson's disease. However, there's a recent concern amongst clinicians, drug developers, and certainly among regulators that Part 3, an impairment scale, may not be that as important to patients and families, and that Part 2 itself, particularly Part 2 of the MDS-UPDRS itself, should form the basis of approval for Parkinson's drugs. Now, regulators haven't said that's the only scale you can use, but it's one that's available, well-developed, and recognized to be a patient-reported outcome scale, which also measures function. In many cases, regulators have suggested that this scale, the MDS-UPDRS Part 2, be used as a primary outcome measure for assessing a new treatment in Parkinson's disease. Now, this would be quite a change from what's happened in the past, and that's really what's new in trial endpoints from my perspective. Well, why is that so new, focusing on Part 2 instead of Part 2 and Part 3? Well, let's look at the potential implications of what that might mean regarding clinical trial design. So to do that, along with my colleagues at the University of Rochester, an academic institution, and Blackfin, a private company, we gathered together data from the Parkinson Progression Marker Initiative study funded by the Michael J. Fox Foundation, and the STEADY PD study, a Parkinson's study group clinical trial conducted by, or funded by NIH, and pulled together all that information about early untreated Parkinson's disease and looked at the baseline severity and the change over time in Part 2 alone and Part 2 plus 3, sort of the new suggested outcome measure plus the traditional outcome measure. We found the following. At the baseline, the average Part 2 score alone was about 5, but a very large number of the people in those two studies had a value of 0. Now, if the value is 0, there's no possibility in the short run of showing improvement because that's as good as you can get. 0 is the best score. It means no impairment. That also suggests that Part 2 alone, as a measure of disability and function, is not very sensitive to early changes in Parkinson's disease. In contrast, the traditional measure of Part 2 plus 3, the baseline score was 25. And over time, Part 2 alone, that is over time of 1 year, only changed by 2 points in Part 2 alone, whereas it changed by 7 points in Part 2 plus 3. What does that imply for clinical trial design? Well, if you were to say, let's try to slow a 1-year progression by 30% with 80% power and 5% statistical significance, if you were going to use Part 2 plus 3 as the outcome measure, you would need about 300 subjects per group. If you were going to use Part 2 alone that would translate into a sample size of about 500 subjects, a 2/3 increase in size in the study. If we took the questions from part 3 that reflect function, that is speech and ambulation, and add that to part 2, we can drop the sample size down to about 400, but that's still a 30% increase in sample size. So the shift to using MDS-UPDRS part 2 as a sole primary outcome measure will have big implications for the size and cost of clinical trials, increasing their sample size by between 1/3 and 2/3. That also limits the number of studies we can do because more patients will be occupied in evaluating a fewer number of interventions. Now, what could we do about this? Well, we could modify the MDS-UPDRS to make it more sensitive to these early changes in Parkinson's disease, or to add items to it so that it covers a broader scope, but that would take some time to modify the scale. Another thing we could do is shift to these performance-based assessments and look at how people actually perform tasks. But again, such a scale has not been well developed yet in Parkinson's disease. And thirdly, we could move to something entirely different, such as sensor-based assessments, evaluating a person's function in their home on a daily basis. Such scales are being developed, but neither a performance-based assessment nor a sensor-based assessment has been established sufficiently to function as a primary outcome measure in clinical trials. So for now, we're going to have to focus on part 2 and think about ways to make it more sensitive or to adopt and find other measures of function which can be used as the basis of approval in Parkinson's disease. Hope this gives you a little insight into what's happening in the world of clinical trial endpoints in PD.